Hello, and everybody, and welcome back to Unorganized Religion. If you'll do me a favor and make sure you are muted, that will just keep it easier for background noise. And in a minute, we're going to have a little video we're watching, or a big video, and so I don't want to have the Zoom fighting for who's in charge. First, though, I do want to apologize for last week's Zoom call. Apparently, I had my presentation backwards. So you saw the presenter side of the PowerPoint that I was using. Honestly, I'm not sure how that even happens, but I think I have everything fixed. So you see a full screen now, right? Yes. Okay, good. So I had it backwards, and I don't even know how that happened. But for tonight, I wanted to do just a quick, recap and rundown of everything that we've done so far. The first week, we kind of outlined the Christian state of affairs, sort of immediately following the ascension of Christ and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. We talked about how the church spread pretty rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, thanks to a couple things. One of those being the Roman infrastructure with roads and trade and, commerce and security, things that made it easy to travel that was kind of new and unusual for that time. And then the other was the urgency with which Christianity sort of functioned. We talked about how to the early church, the earliest Christians believed that Jesus's return was imminent, more than imminent, really. It was like in the next month or week or day or even hour. And so they thought Jesus was kind of doing like a quick stop in heaven and then turning around and coming right on back to take them with him. So this attitude, sort of fueled an urgency and a fire of passion around sharing Jesus's message of forgiveness and mercy and love and grace and all of the things that Jesus talked about. At first, this spread sort of faced resistance from the Jews for obvious reasons. But soon after, that quickly expanded to the Roman Empire and the Roman imperial state. So last week we had the brain bruising experience of looking at all of the some of the different sects of Christianity in that first couple hundred years. We talked about Gnosticism and gnosis, or that secret knowledge. And you remember that the Gnostics separated material creation from the spiritual realm, and sort of equated, all the problems and the sins of the world to that material and that physical creation. It seems strange to imagine a Christianity that, struggled not with same-sex marriage or women pastors, but like the spiritual content of Jesus and what Jesus was made up of. So to us, that's kind of mind-blowing, but that's what they were dealing with at the time. We talked about some other individual groups like the Docetism, that thought Jesus only appeared human, wasn't actually human, just kind of spiritual in makeup. And we kind of ruminated a little bit on why does that matter theologically, and what does it mean for our faith that God may not have created the earth. And like Markian thought that, the inferior God, or the God of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the God of the Jews, sort of messed up when that God created the universe and material components. So these are, hang on a second, what you need? Yeah, sure, sorry. Everyone, hi, this is my sister. She needs her computer that's underneath me. It is. Thank you. You're welcome. Anyways, so we left off with kind of, thinking theologically about what those things do to our faith and how we might respond, trying to struggle with stuff like that. The other question we've been really, we've kind of looked at is what it meant to be a Christian at this time. How do we live? What do we believe about our ancestors? What do we believe about Jesus? What does our future look like as Christians? How do we interact with the Roman Empire at this time, but other civil authorities and the pagan practices that were associated with the imperial cult, as it was called, the group that the Roman religion that thought the empire or emperor was a god. And so we call that the imperial cult, and how Christianity fits into that kind of government. So all of these things were really heavy on the mind of the earliest Christians. The first week, we hit a little bit on some persecutions. But this week, I really want to spend some time on the persecutions in the 2nd century. So we talked about Nero and Domitian. Those were kind of 1st century. Now I want to spend some time in the 2nd century. And then I've got an interview that I want us to listen to. So tonight I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we've got about 28 or 30 minutes of this interview that I want us to listen to. And then what we'll do is we'll start next week with questions from this week. That way we can have a little time for some responsive stuff there. So let's go back to week 1. First that we talked about was the Emperor Nero. So remember in 64 CE, there was a massive fire in Rome. And the emperor is obviously Nero. This is a great picture of it. This a forensic reconstruction artist took images and statues and descriptions of some famous people in history. I think Jesus was in this list too, and did some more formalized scientific reconstructions of them. And this is what he came up with for Nero. So this is what Nero looked like, as close as we can get. Remember that story? The Roman historian Tacitus was convinced that the fire was started in an oil warehouse. And then, with all of the wooden structures that cities were built out of, it just was difficult to stop. 10 out of the 14 sections of the city were destroyed in the fire. And since 2 of the sections left were really the only 2, were heavily populated by Jews and proto-Christians, Nero blamed that group for the fire, and particularly the Christians, because they were pretty unliked, saying that they set it to destroy the city because that's who killed Jesus. So if they destroyed Rome, they got back for killing Jesus. So Nero began a very targeted persecution of the Christians in Rome. And that's where it's likely that Saints Peter and Paul were victims of that persecution. So Christians were used in war games, buried alive, crucified, and any other cruel and unusual torture that Nero could think of. The other person that we talked about was this guy, Domitian. Remember that from a historical and political perspective, Domitian was a really good emperor. He did a lot of things for the Roman economy. He revalued the coins, so he upped the amount of silver in them, which changed their weight and strengthened the Roman economy, which had been struggling before that. He was also a good military strategist, and he kind of strengthened the pretty flexible borders of the Roman Empire, sort of setting for at least a couple decades a border that the Roman Empire could hold. He worked to rebuild Rome that was in shambles from various fires, attacks, natural disasters, just general degradation of the city. So he had quite a building program, and he was a staunch advocate of the old Roman ways. So he worked really hard to see art and culture, music, economy, sport, all of that returned to really the height of the Roman Empire. And the 2 groups of people that bucked that system were the Jews and the Christians, because they had one God alone, and there were so many cultural practices that they had to stick to keep their faith, that they really made it difficult for Nero or Domitian to claim that old Rome feel. So there's evidence for fierce persecution of Jews and Christians, including, like Nero did, actual, murders and killings, but then also legislation. So there were laws passed that limited Jews and Christians' ability and access to public works and public places throughout the Roman Empire. But this was pretty targeted to a little bit in the capital, but mostly in Asia Minor, or that part that we now call Turkey. So by the beginning of the 2nd century, this is after 100 CE, we have some written correspondence that gives us some insight into the official Roman state attitude toward the Christians. So these aren't hearsay stories. These aren't, we heard from this church that they faced persecution or were having a hard time. This is Roman sources that document the empire's official stance on Christianity. So in 111 CE, Pliny the Younger, that's the guy on the left with the sort of curly hair there, is appointed as a governor of Bithynia, which was a Roman province on the northern part of that Asia Minor, or what we call Turkey, so up there on the coast. And he was shocked after taking his office just how many Christians there were in his province. His writing indicates that the pagan temples are near deserted. And he even makes a note about how the seller of animals for sacrifices, so people that make a living selling these animals for sacrifice to gods, they're struggling to find buyers. So Christianity has that much of a hold in this area. He's not quite sure how to handle them. So he writes to the emperor at the time, Trajan, that's who's on the right there in the armor, and seeks help on how to best deal with these Christians in his province. So Trajan's response is really interesting and serves, to me, it was kind of a different response than we might expect out of a Roman emperor, especially having heard stories of Nero and of Domitian. Trajan responds saying, this is a translation, obviously, "They are not to be sought out, but if they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished." So they're not to be sought out. So the official state position is like, okay, it's illegal to be Christian, sort of, kind of, but they're really not hurting anyone. So let's not waste our resources, trying to track them down or anything. That's a pretty different response than Nero's and Domitian's, right? Christians were not on the radar for the Roman state through most of this time period. So that Pliny, Trajan, there's a lot more writing between the two of them. They're sort of confidants to each other. They're definitely friends. And that's the only part we see about Christianity. But through their interactions, we can see how, Trajan is really a good emperor for prioritizing threats. And Christianity, at least, if any religion, is not at the top of his threat list. So really Christians, beside the occasional, murder, and you have to think too, in this time, life was pretty cheap, right? It was nothing for an official to kill someone on the street because they were in their way, or, they stole, an apple from a store, or it was nothing for someone to be executed for really no reason. So we have some of those trivial, accounts of people dying for really no reason. But as a whole, persecution as a religious entity was really not on the Roman radar at this time. However, the next notable persecution, quotes, I say that in quotes because it's that individual targeted, localized persecution we talked about, is under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was toward the 2nd century. And I just love that name. I want to name someone Marcus. Maybe I'll get a dog and name them Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a really interesting emperor. So, unlike our stereotypical Roman emperor, right, the person who is enamored with power and vain, the image, the robes, the purple, the crown, Marcus Aurelius was really a well-refined gentleman, and he had a regard for art and philosophy and intellect. And he used all of those things to rule his empire rather than just the, guts and glory and the military kind of strong arming that many emperors are known for. Even good emperors are known for that. It's said that the Roman standard, the image, the eagle on the cross, struck fear into people's hearts just because they knew what would happen. And Marcus Aurelius was not that way per se. He was a supporter of building and of artistic things. So he held festivals, things that had been kind of out of the practice of the Roman Empire for a long time. He has a collection of personal writings called the Meditations. They were poems and stories and accounts of his life, and those proved to be, that collection, Meditations, proved to be probably one of the greatest literary writings of the time period. I'm not a literature scholar, historian scholar, so I can't speak that with any authority. But that writing from the middle to late 2nd century really was an important part of developing style. So it would seem that an emperor who was dedicated to things like art and philosophy and peace and well-being would be a real supporter of the Christians. But surprisingly, that is not the case at all. He was quite a supporter of Christian persecutions around the empire during his reign. And one of the most documented under Marcus Aurelius was in Gaul, or present-day France, in the city of what is now called Lyon, Lyon, in the sort of middle south part of France. And it began with some legislation, local legislation, that restricted Christians from any public place. So known Christians were not allowed to go to public places like markets, theaters, gyms, or baths. But it slowly evolved into a persecution, a real persecution, where suspected Christians were tried and they were punished, and they faced all kinds of cruel methods of torture or execution. It was written that the slaves of these Christians turned them in, and the slaves came to the officials with reports of cannibalism and incest. Right, to us, that's just flabbergasting. How could they say that, right? But to a non-Christian, think for a minute, you couldn't really blame them. So imagine you were a slave and you were working for your master, and they had a gathering of friends over, and it was, let's say it was 3 couples. So husband, wife, husband, wife, husband, wife. And you heard them in the next room saying, "This is my body, take it and eat." Well, what would you think, right? You would imagine there was something cannibalistic. And then you knew that husband and wife would then kiss each other and say, "I love you, my brother, and I love you, my sister." So these claims of cannibalism and incest end up being one of Christianity's 2 main problems, because people who aren't Christians don't understand the symbolism of communion. We don't believe it's actually flesh and blood. And at this point, they did not. And the idea that we're all siblings in Christ. So brother and sister, and I did not marry my sister or my brother. That was just what I called them in Christ. And so they would hear these things, in secret. So to a slave who is probably uneducated, but, cognizant enough of their social surroundings to hear those things, it probably did sound like cannibalism and incest, and they probably thought they were doing the right thing. We take for granted now how weird some of this language is, right, to others, to non-Christians, and that's sharing our faith with people who have no exposure to Christianity from other parts of the world. That's just something really hard for people to grasp. The idea of ritualistically eating our Savior's body and blood. So it took a little bit of work and practice, but at this time, that's what it sounded like. So after Marcus Aurelius's reign, the next couple of emperors had a little bit more to deal with. There were some civil wars that took a lot of attention. There were invasions that took a lot of attention. So the Christians kind of had a period of peace, overall relative peace after this, at least until the beginning of the 3rd century. So probably 20 or 30 years of relative peace. The other piece of information that I want to talk about before we hear this interview is this idea of the cult of the saints. So the idea of martyrdom has been glorified throughout most of Christianity. Martyrdom being, you were killed or you died in an attempt to either share your faith or defending your faith from an attack of some kind. And all of this really began all the way back in the first couple hundred years. The person we're going to listen to, Dr. Candida Moss, she calls this the age of the martyrs, actually. She's the one who we'll be hearing from in just a second. These martyrs and their followers really lived into Jesus's hope that his followers take up their cross and follow him. So they really thought that Jesus meant literally, take up your cross like he did. So the highest honor a Christian could receive was to die defending Jesus' message, or die because you were a follower of that message. All of these early saints and followers of Jesus who were killed in persecutions around the Roman Empire were given a very special and exalted place in faith. The idea of relics began in the period that this class covers, so that first couple, 200 or 300 years. And relics, if you're unfamiliar, are pieces of, now they're of saints' lives, but in the beginning they were just of martyrs' lives. So maybe there were bones of martyrs, or hair, or a part of their body even. And these were venerated as sacred and holy because that person was sacred and holy due to their death as a martyr. And it got even to the crazy point where congregations would build their faith communities around relics or sacred sites of martyrs. So touching a martyr's bones, or being at their place of death, praying that the martyr might pray to God for them, or gosh, even being buried close to a martyr's bones, were all ways that someone could increase their standing in God's eyes and allow them, special privileges in their faith. So this sounds kind of crazy to us, but to the Christians of Middle and Late Antiquity, so that period where we are now, the martyrs sort of showed us a tangible reward for an avid devotion. And that was, immediate presence with God, something that everyone else was having to wait for, right? Peter Brown, who is a professor at Princeton, or was, wrote a great book in the early 80s. It was reprinted not too long ago, I think 14 or 15, about this group that we call the Cult of the Saints. And he kind of talked about how their devotion to the life and work and bodies of saints really impacted the development of Christianity. So, imagine what that does to faith. Up to this point, Christians were sharing Jesus's message and awaiting his return, but we were all kind of on the same playing field. So the idea of these saints that were closer to God because of being martyred and being killed in defense of Christ, sort of sets a hierarchy of people in the faith. And that hierarchy really comes down to play once we get into imperial Christianity, which this class doesn't cover. But once the Roman Empire sort of stratifies and organizes the religion, that's where some of this ranking comes in. So much that even the saints and the relics, there's a first order relic and a second order relic. So all the way down to these pieces of saints, the toe of this saint and, the left earlobe of that saint, they all are incredibly important and they're all ranked. So this idea of ranking begins even before the empire gets their hands on it. So up here, I have two different relics that I thought were fascinating. I chose these because they're from the time period of this class. First, we have the chains of St. Peter. Supposedly, these are the chains that St. Peter was bound in when he was being scourged before taken to be crucified. How they got there, not quite sure. And then we have the arm of Polycarp. Polycarp was a bishop in the early church in the first century, late first century. And so in this relic, I'm more inclined to believe this one than the St. Peter one, but there is a sort of gold hand, and inside the hand you see there's a little window, a little viewing window right there, and there are a couple bone fragments. And so this is venerated as the arm of St. Polycarp. And devotion to these materials is just unbelievable. I don't know if any of you keep up with the Catholic Cathedral in Knoxville, but the Sacred Heart of John Vianney, who was a patron saint of priests, of like parish priests, came through the cathedral last year. And it's amazing. There is a halfway shriveled up, decomposed heart in a wood box with a glass door on the front of it. And so even today, this idea of cult of the saints is still kind of pervasive and still sort of trickles into our religion. Methodists have a practice of, we really only venerate saints that are in the Bible. That's kind of our basic doctrine. We don't have a process for creating saints per se in the formal sense of the word. So we have St. Peter, and we have St. Paul and St. Mark's and all these different places we find churches named after St. Anna. So we don't quite have the same cultural practice with saints, but it definitely is still out there in the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. The Episcopal Church even has some of it. So it's interesting that that history that's almost 2,000 years old at this point still actively, engages in what we're doing today. All right. That's about all of the new content. Does anybody have any questions? We could probably take 3 or 4 minutes of questions up to this point on martyrdom or persecution or relics, I guess.
Was everybody persecuted? I mean, even children?
So in those, so what did it take to be persecuted? That's a pretty good question. For most of the Roman Empire, your devotion to your emperor was the number one thing you wanted. Devotion to the emperor. And in the imperial cult, the emperor was a god. And so for the pagan or polytheistic practice, you venerated a god by lighting incense or sacrificing something to a statue or an idol of them. So when these accused Christians were brought in, most all of the time, the only way they had to get out of it, even if they said they were a Christian, was to light incense at a statue of the emperor, and they would let them go. And that went all the way from children to adults to seniors, all throughout there. That was all the emperor wanted, was just that you were loyal to the emperor. So definitely children were involved, as horrible as it was. Children were persecuted and martyred. Families were martyred together. But sometimes a family would recant and they would light their incense and go home. And that led to another part of Christianity that we'll get to, is what do you do with all of the Christians who buckled under pressure and sacrificed to the emperor in persecution? So there's that's probably the biggest rift that Christianity faced before the East-West split, was what do you do with Reformed Christians? But yeah, children were absolutely a part of that.
Huh. Wow. And are there hundreds and thousands of relics? I guess there are.
Oh, there are relics everywhere. For example, Catholic churches. A Catholic church altar is not a Catholic church altar until there is a relic inside of it. So inside of every Catholic altar, there's what's called a reliquary, or a place for a relic. And you get some kind of relic placed in the altar, and at the consecration of a new church, the bishop actually seals that shut. So yes, there are relics everywhere, and they could range anything from a body, like a full body, to a crown or a something that was worn, a necklace, a pendant, or it could be a left pinky toenail of a saint. I say that sort of flippantly, but that's how it is. Anything, even on the minute side, that could possibly have been related to this saint can be relict. Yeah.
I remember now. We did visit a cathedral in Sweden, and it had some saint's necklace. I remember that now. That was in the cathedral. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are some relics that are more famous than other. For example, when Notre Dame burned a couple years ago, someone had the foresight to grab the crown of thorns. Supposedly, Jesus' crown of thorns was held at Notre Dame. So there are relics all over the place. Go ahead, Lee.
I pardon my saying so, but I have a hard time breaking the connection. If you're looking this arm of Polycarp and the golden calf, worshiping the golden calf. I mean, you've got a symbol here that is drawing all your attention, and I have a hard time separating that concept.
It's a very fine line, and Catholics will tell you it is in the semantics, and they use the term venerate, not worship. So since I'm not Catholic, that's as far as I can speak to it with any authority. Yeah. So, go ahead. Somebody say something? One more time, whoever said that. I'm sorry, you kind of cut out. No? Okay. Well, let's get on to this interview. So Dr. Candida Moss, She's currently teaching and researching at the University of Birmingham. That's in the UK, not Alabama. But for a long time, she was the professor of New Testament and early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame here in the United States. And her particular field of study is martyrdom and in the early church. And she has this wonderful book called The Myth of Persecution. I 100% recommend you read this one. If you go to the course website, I put the information about it in there. She writes in this book about how the early church sort of created a sense of martyrdom and perpetual persecution. So not local, but continued persecution to kind of make themselves more comfortable in the political and social setting of the Roman Empire. So what we're listening to is a podcast, and it's an interview with her, and she discusses some of the points she makes in this book. I think you'll be okay to understanding without having read the book so far. The podcast is really good. But I would definitely recommend reading. It's not super dry. It's not a crazy difficult read at all, but it's really fascinating. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on for you as we listen to it. If you're not muted, please make sure you are. That'll just save background noise with something like this. And then a reminder, we'll start next week with some question times. So feel free to jot down questions you might have, or if you just can't wait, you can shoot me an email, okay? Let me switch over here. And I need to turn off my headset so you can hear. All right, y'all hear? Okay.
View for today with Candida Moss from Notre Dame University, who teaches New Testament there. She's written a new book that advances the thesis that a lot of these martyr stories are in fact myths.
Well, does Notre Dame know she wrote this book? That seems like she was immediately kicked out. Something they would be not pleased with.
No, from reading the book, you get the idea that this stuff is fairly common knowledge in the academic, and it's just about addressing that popular belief that for the first 300 years of Christianity that they were systematically and continuously persecuted.
Her book is The Myth of Persecution, and we had a fascinating interview with her that we're going to share with you now.
Joining us by telephone is Candida Moss. Candida is the author of a new book, The Myth of Persecution, How Early Christians Invented a Story of Martyrdom. Candida is professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at the University of Notre Dame. Candida Moss, thank you very much for joining us on Reasonable Doubts today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I found this book fascinating. I wanted to ask you, looking over your past publications, you've written several books on early Christian martyrdom. What is it about the subject of early Christian martyrdom that piques your interest? And is the answer that you give to this question, is it going to be different as a scholar than as a person of faith?
Well, I've been interested in martyrdom for a while, and I think when I initially got interested in it, I just found the stories so fascinating. These are great stories. You just want to hear them. And I just sort of wanted to tell people about how important ideas about martyrdom were in the early church. And then gradually I realized that sort of today people have a lot of misconceptions about what happened to early Christians, and I sort of wanted to correct those misconceptions, even though I really appreciated these stories. I would say that I initially got interested in martyrs as a person of faith who was sort of drawn to these stories. And the reason that I wrote this book was because as a scholar, I felt that I couldn't allow other Christians to sort of perpetuate these myths about what had happened in the early church. So yeah, there's sort of a difference between my scholarly interests and my interest as a Christian.
Well, we hear it all the time in Sunday school and in political debates. You know, Christians are relentlessly persecuted because of their faith, and this has been going on since the very early years of the Christian movement, especially those first 300 years, where we're supposed to believe that apparently Christians were systematically hunted down by the Romans for roughly 300 years. So the question is, what is wrong with this view of history?
I think what's along with this view of history, just, well, initially, it's just wrong. This is not what our historical evidence leads us to believe. Whenever we have Romans inaugurating these brief periods of persecution, and we're only talking about really 2 brief periods, but they start with legislation that makes it clear that Christians were very comfortable and even flourishing in the Roman Empire. So the first reason why it needs correction is simply that it's wrong. But it's not just that it's inaccurate. It's not just that, we've overblown this myth. The problem is that people still think this, and they think it in ways that affect how they act today. So Christians today talk about themselves and think about themselves as persecuted because of this history of persecution. They sort of identify with Jesus, they identify with the early church, and they say that they're persecuted just like Jesus and the apostles. And when we look at the evidence and realize that the early church wasn't persecuted, then that has to force us to think about whether or not we're persecuted now.
For about 8 years under the Roman Empire Decius, there was actual legislation in place that forced Christians to choose between sacrificing to the imperial cult or remaining loyal to Christ. Now, if they refused, of course, they would be executed. Why was this legislation put in place? And couldn't this perhaps be rightly seen as Christian persecution?
The first thing I would say is even that edict, the Edict of Decius, which for a long time we did think was persecution of Christians, all of our evidence for its implementation comes from a single month. So in terms of this legislation being in place for 8 years, we don't know that it was in place for 8 years. It all comes from 1 month. And was this legislation that forced Christians to do something that they felt they couldn't do? Yes, it was. I think what we need to take into account here is what the Emperor Decius was trying to do was to get people to come back to the imperial cult. He was doing that in order to sort of fortify the empire, to please the gods, and to sort of unify the empire so that it would be stronger in defending itself against attack. Now, in doing that, he wasn't doing anything new. This is what Romans had been doing for centuries beforehand. They had wanted people to participate in this cult. So this wasn't a religious innovation. And when he did it, maybe he knew, maybe he had a sneaking suspicion that there might be this small group of people that wouldn't be willing to do this. But it's not as if he was thinking, let's go get the Christians. So I guess what I would say is this law is unjust, and it's particularly unjust from our perspective as moderns. But at the time, it was very acceptable, and Decius really had the moral high ground. And it wasn't persecution because he wasn't targeting Christians. He was asking people to do something that they were already supposed to be doing under law.
Now, Jews were exempted under these laws. Is that correct? Because they were an older monotheistic faith?
To an extent, although archaeological evidence suggests that the Jews had negotiated sort of a compromise with the Romans, but they did have special status because Judaism was a religion. It was this ancient religion, and the Romans knew that the Jews were very serious about their monotheism. They could look back at the stories of the Maccabees and know that they really didn't want to cause trouble. At the same time, they weren't evangelizing. They weren't out to win new converts. Christianity was different. The Romans described Christianity as a superstitio, and it's easy to say, it's just a superstition. But what that word really meant to ancient Romans was it was sort of like a contagious, crazed position. So they were sort of, Christians were spreading this contagious madness to other people. And so the Romans wanted to limit that, understandably.
Do you think that had anything to do with them being such a new movement? Had they been as established as Judaism and had those years of history behind them, might the Romans have treated them very much the same way?
I think if Christianity had been established, if it hadn't been trying to evangelize, and if it hadn't utilized this language of a new emperor and a new reign and a king who's going to come and change everything, that king being Jesus, then the Romans wouldn't have been interested in Christians at all. But because they did sound like revolutionaries, And because they were actively out there trying to get other people to convert, and thus other people not to participate in the structures of the Roman Empire, I think the Romans had every reason to be suspicious.
At the start of your book, you discuss the ancient Greco-Roman view of a good death. Now, of course, not everybody agreed on the specifics of what was actually worth dying for, but could you talk about the common ground that people generally did share regarding their views of what it was to die nobly or to have a good death?
Yeah, well, everyone in the ancient world knew that death was inevitable and that life was extremely fragile. And so they didn't sort of valorize trying to stay alive at all costs the way that we do now. Instead, they felt that, if the situation demanded it, you should be willing to lay down your life for something greater than yourself, be that your family, and that's something we could identify with now, but also your country and your God, and also just your principles. These were things that it was worth dying for. That's how you really die like a man. And if you do die that kind of death, ancient Greeks and Romans and Jews all believed that you could expect to be remembered by others, to be remembered as a hero. And so everyone really valorized the good death and thought that this was one of the ways in which you distinguish yourself and be remembered.
Something I found interesting is that you argue that the author of Luke's Gospel does some significant editing in order to portray Jesus' death as in line with the Greco-Roman view of the good death. What are some of the relevant differences between Jesus' death portrayed in Luke's Gospel and Jesus' death as portrayed in Luke's earlier source material, the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, the differences are very striking. So when you think about Jesus in Mark, Jesus is sort of weak and unsure of himself. So when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, he pretty much begs God that he be allowed not to die. Mark says that he's grieved. Jesus in Mark begs the disciples to stay awake because he's upset. He throws himself on the ground. He's distressed. There's no getting away from it.
Right.
Luke takes all of that out. So Luke has Jesus kneel down. Luke asks the disciples to pray, but it's almost like he's sort of instructing them. And then when you think about the actual death themselves, in Mark, the very last thing that Jesus says is, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, the last thing he says is, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It's incredibly self-controlled.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just reading Mark, it sounds like he sort of dies in anguish. But in Luke, he's self-controlled, and it's almost like he wills himself to die, and then he does. It's a very different kind of death. It's sort of self-controlled and reserved and respectable. Everything that Mark isn't.
Right. It's the opposite of a humiliation, which is what you almost get from Mark, right? The suffering servant, misunderstood, humiliated up there on the cross, and then, cool, calm, confident Jesus in the Gospel of Luke.
That's right, and that's probably because Luke wants to sort of explain to his audience that Jesus really does die in the way that they admire. He's like the philosophers.
So it's to kind of expand the scope of the appeal of the Christian message in a way.
That's right. I mean, it's not about lying. It is exactly about that. It's about expanding the appeal. It's about giving your audience something that they understand. And the audiences, Luke's gospel, understand the sort of cool, calm, collected death. They admire that. They don't admire someone who's being humiliated.
In your book, you talk about how some early Christian martyr stories seem historically suspect because they seem clearly influenced by earlier Greek, pagan, and Jewish motifs. Could you give a couple examples of that?
Right. Well, there are lots of places in early Christian martyrdom stories where the actual sort of script will come out of other early Christian texts. So martyrs will say things that Jesus said. They'll say things that the authors of the text have written elsewhere. In certain stories, there's a lot of things that sound like she's a heroine from sort of Greek mythology. So when she ascends this ladder to heaven, she is told not to look back, a little bit like Orpheus and Eurydice leaving the underworld. Just before she dies, she sort of tugs down her garment and exposes her neck, and the Latin there sounds a lot like a heroine of Greco-Roman mythology who is killed in a very similar fashion. You have to sort of look at the text and look at the flow of these stories, but it's clear that early Christians are sort of not directly copying, but definitely emulating these stories from Greek and Roman mythology and from ancient Jewish folklore.
This has been one of the reoccurring themes for me as I try to study more about biblical history, is recognizing sets of conventions that were used in ancient literature, like themes that the audience would have recognized and understood right away, but because we're not always familiar with this ancient literature, it doesn't jump out to us in the same way.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't necessarily, to us as modern readers, it doesn't jump out at us. But it would be a little bit like if you read a story and someone talked about the war on terror, you would know instantly that there is this reference to 9/11 and to terrorism. So even if the story was about something else, you would hear that.
Right.
Or if I told you a story about in which someone said that they could not tell a lie, that would be very evocative to Americans. So I think that when you look at them and you look at these stories placed alongside ancient Greek and Roman examples, suddenly they jump out at you and you realize, oh, this was really common. The death of Socrates was probably the best known death in the ancient world. Everyone knew about how Socrates had been brave and had drunk hemlock. And so when you see allusions to that story in Christian literature, you know that the authors of those texts are trying to present their heroes as being like Socrates.
And so while some martyrdom stories seem to have borrowed from earlier traditions, others seem suspicious because they seem identical to other contemporary versions of the story. And so there would be, some narrative, and then there would be another narrative, and everything would be identical, with the exception of the actual names of the characters.
Almost like a form letter. Insert your martyr here, martyr's name here.
That occurs more and more the later you go. Martyrs become incredibly popular in the Christian era after Constantine has allowed Christianity to become the state religion. And, there's a lot of pressure on these scribes and priests to write up stories of local heroes, and they'd be given the name of someone and they'd know nothing about them. And, it's hard work writing. It's much easier to just copy out another story and change the name. And that was what they did.
So a nice martyrdom template, in a way.
That's right. Exactly.
There's this very popular belief that about Emperor Nero, that he used the earlier Christians as a scapegoat for the Great Fire of Rome in 64, and of course, as a result, many Christians were targeted and put to death in terrible ways. And this idea comes from Tacitus, the Roman historian, and he's writing in 115 to 120. This is about 50 years after the fire, but your book gives us a few additional reasons why Tacitus's historical account is highly unlikely.
Yeah, and I should add real quick that this is part of what makes the story of Nero so credible to me. It's because it is written by Tacitus. It's not from a Christian source. It's not from one even sympathetic to Christian sources. Tacitus says some very terrible things. So you would think that would be some of the most sound evidence coming from him.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes people will criticize me for being skeptical of Christian sources, and they'll say, why are you so skeptical of Christian sources? Why aren't you skeptical of Roman sources? And I'll say, I'm skeptical of everything. I want to see the evidence. It's tempting to just believe Tacitus because he's a Roman historian, but we have to treat him the way we would treat any other historian.
Right.
And it's clear that Tacitus does not like Nero. None of the historians like Nero. And when it comes to Tacitus's evidence, I think what's curious is he says that Nero blames the Christians, which would mean that in the early 60s, the name Christian was sort of circulating widely enough that the Emperor Nero himself knew it. It's not just Christians calling themselves Christians. It would be other people recognizing them as such, so that even the Roman Emperor knew who they were. But Christians don't even start using that word to describe themselves until the end of the 1st century. So Paul, who was apparently killed by Nero, never calls anyone a Christian, never calls himself a Christian. So you have to wonder if it was really possible that during the reign of Nero that he knew enough about the existence of this small group of Jesus followers to target them. And we have to consider the possibilities that Tacitus is retrojecting into the 1st century his own opinion of Christians, and that he's using that to sort of further condemn Nero, whom he doesn't like.
Obviously, Nero was not a pleasant fellow, so it seems kind of feels bad exonerating him. I do have a hero who apparently has some Christian blood on his hands too, Marcus Aurelius. Did you do any research on him? Is it true that he really did? Because he seems to me like such a compassionate guy, and from his writing, from his meditations, you hear that he talks about everyone living in harmony. And it's always been a disappointment for me to think that he had his hand in some of that persecution.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. I will actually tell you that some of the later Christian historians also tried to exonerate Marcus Aurelius and make it seem like he wasn't involved at all because they really liked him too. There were Christians who died during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, and in fact, they died in Rome. Now, they weren't tried by Marcus Aurelius, so if you're concerned about him personally, then I would say he might not have known.
Okay.
They were tried by one of his teachers called Rusticus, who he actually mentions in his writings as this amazing Stoic instructor. But in the Christian stories that Rusticus appears, Rusticus doesn't seem like that at all. He gets sort of angry and upset, not at all Stoic. Which is really interesting because it seems like the Christian editors of this story are trying to sort of make Rusticus seem like he's not a very good Stoic, not a very good philosopher at all. Yeah. It's sort of fictional characterization. And this is the problem we have with so many of these stories. The Christians who are described in the story probably died. But the manner of their death, their trials, sort of whether or not they were being persecuted, that kind of information we just can't know because the stories have been to an extent reworked or edited, or some might say contaminated by the interests of later Christian authors and editors.
So it's just impossible to say.
Right, and I know that's not satisfying, but it's important because you can venerate martyrs without saying Christians are being persecuted. And given that this persecution stuff has had such a lasting impact in the Christian consciousness, it's important to admit what we don't know, and we don't know this.
Right. And I like that point that you make. And another thing that's sometimes not brought up in these conversations is that there were other martyrs for other causes back then too. And we were just talking about Stoics a minute ago. Seneca was martyred. He was a teacher of Nero and apparently didn't stay on Nero's good side. We have a lot of stories coming out from these ages of people who lost their heads defending a noble cause. These stories are deeply satisfying. Maybe you could address that briefly. Are there some positive things to come out of these martyr stories for people who read them?
Yeah, I think there are. These are stories of courage and heroism, of sort of, well, I don't know if philosophers are ordinary, but of sort of regular people sort of overcoming the limitations of human frailty in order to be willing to die for what they believe in. And these are inspirational. I think my favorite Christian martyr is asked if he really thinks that he'll go to heaven if he dies. And he's a philosophical type of martyr, and he says, well, maybe not, but it would be worth dying because on account of Jesus, he had learned how to live a good and ethical life. And every time I read that story, I sort of, I pause because I think that's so admirable. And I think there are lots of positive things we can get out of these stories. And we can get that out of them whether or not every detail is true.
Right. With a lot of biblical studies, it's one thing to notice what this meant to the people who were reading them and why it was important in their development, and it's quite another the question of whether or not they are accurate. Yes, I'm glad you're saying that we can learn and admire these stories for one reason and then yet see the dark side to them, which unfortunately is all too common when, kicking prayer out of the public schools becomes persecution of the type, sometimes compared directly, of the type that are in these martyr stories. You have to start scratching your head and wonder if that's the message we should be taking away.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, for a number of reasons. The first is that that's just such overblown rhetoric when it comes to, say, kicking prayer out of public schools. And it completely avoids the debate, which is a debate about how we educate our children. And recasting that as sort of like an apocalyptic struggle between good and evil makes it impossible to have reasonable conversations about things. And at the same time, you're taking language that actually does still have meaning. People are persecuted, just not in America.
Right.
And sort of taking the language of persecution and applying it to sort of small political or social disagreements means that those stories really don't get heard.
Right. You want to see Christian persecution in this world? Look at, the Coptic Christians in Egypt. Look at...
That's right.
Yeah. There's plenty of, there's plenty of places that Sudan, we could just start going down a list where Christian persecution is real and needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and the reporting of that is overshadowed by the complaints of Americans that they're persecuted. So it does a lot of damage, I think.
You write that that many Christians saw the death of Jesus as an ideal to strive towards, to such a degree that sometimes they would go to extreme lengths to achieve it. One instance that you discuss in your book centers around a mob of Christians and Arius Antoninus, the governor of Asia in 185. Could you tell that story?
Right. This story comes to us from Tertullian, who lived in North Africa, and he says that this whole group of Christians went to the governor's house and demanded that he sentence them to die for being Christians because they wanted to be a martyr, or be lots of martyrs, rather. And he told them that if they wanted to die, they had ropes to hang themselves with. He just wasn't going to participate in this. And it's such an interesting story. It demonstrates first that Christians weren't being persecuted. If there was any legislation against them, he would have had to have killed them.
Right.
But it also demonstrates that Christians took this very seriously. Sometimes we'll hear that Christians would never volunteer to die. They would never do this. They're always sort of passive, innocent victims. And it's worth noting that at the time when this happened, Christians haven't yet developed this sort of elaborate theory of suicide being wrong yet. So it's not as if these Christians think that they're doing something wrong. They just really idealize martyrdom and they want to die as martyrs.
You could argue they're taking up their cross. I mean, I'm sure that's not exactly what Jesus meant, but yeah, you could argue they were told from the beginning they need to emulate Jesus, and
that's right.
What better way to do that than to die for your faith?
Right. Yes. I mean, when Jesus says, "Take up your cross and follow me," he doesn't mean by giving money to charity. He means take up your cross and follow me. And so it is a sort of fairly faithful reading. I don't think that Jesus meant that you should seek out death like this, but you can see how people got there.
Considering that many Christians often see persecution as an intricate part of their personal Christian faith and of the broader Christian narrative, I'm curious as to what has been the reaction from the faith community to your book.
Yeah, well, I think it has been varied, shall we say. Some people have said, "I think you're absolutely right." Others have said, we feel that we are persecuted and you are contributing to that. And this is a betrayal of Christianity and you should resign.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I get everything from you're the spawn of Satan to, great book. And I definitely get more negative emails than positive emails, but I hear that's the same for every
Yeah,
product.
which a reminder to our listeners, take the time out and send emails to authors that you think are doing a good job. Because they really do need that encouragement. I think it really does make a difference.
Yeah, I love this. I do have some really supportive fans, and they really do make a difference.
Candida, thanks again for taking the time out of your day to talk with us.
Well, there you go. So that's a really interesting conversation with Candida Moss. Hope there were some interesting things in there that made you think a little bit. Feel free to think about questions if you have anything. You can email them to me, or we will start next week off with some time and questions. So that's it for tonight. I will see you next week or on email if you want to send me some questions. Hope everybody has a good week.